Well, it's been such a rich and full day. I don't know if we can take more or not, but I think we have more. All of the speakers have been so well qualified and so stimulating. It's just amazing. It gives you some idea of what the Baha'i universities of the future may be like. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you our last speaker, Brian Aull, who's going to speak on the Baha'i faith and 20th century science. Brian was born in Indianapolis. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering from Purdue University, and in 1977, a Master of Science and Electrical Engineer degrees from MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and at the present time he's working on a doctorate degree at the same institution. And he's working on research which centers around optical properties of laser crystals. So once again we have in our presence a very qualified and scholarly individual who is also a member of the Baha'i faith. And it's really wonderful to be able to introduce him and to look forward to what he will have to say to us. Right?
Don't worry, you're not going to get zapped by a laser beam from the back of the room. This is marvelous following these speakers we've had tonight, because there are lots of uncharted territory, not only in the harmony of science and religion, the harmony of art and religion, and the harmony of science and art. So we've got a pyramid going here. What I want to talk about tonight is two basic topics. One of them is the religion as a scientific method. And in that connection, I'm going to clarify some things about what scientific method entails. And contrary to popular notions about it, there is a lot of intuition in science as well. It isn't just dry reasoning. And on the other side of the coin, I want to talk about science as a spiritual tool. So we're going to talk about religion as being scientific and science as being spiritual. Only at a Baha'i conference. Well, maybe not. We can start with a quote from Abdul Baha. God has endowed man with intelligence and reason, whereby he is required to determine the verity of questions and propositions. If religious beliefs and opinions are found contrary to the standards of science, they are mere superstitions and imaginings. For the antithesis of knowledge is ignorance, and the child of ignorance is superstition. Unquestionably, there must be agreement between true religion and science. If a question be found contrary to reason, faith and belief in it are impossible, and there is no outcome but wavering and vacillation. So, you see immediately that Abdul Baha establishes some kind of reasonability as a prerequisite for faith. Now I'm going to talk about science. And I want to debunk the myth that science is rigidly logical and involves merely reasoning from a premise to a conclusion. And in fact, science involves a lot which can be called faith. Now, on the other side of the coin, I'm also going to debunk the myth that religion is just pure subjective emotionalism, whose validity cannot be objectively tested in any way. So let's start with science. Science asks, what is the behavior of the phenomenal world? What is the behavior of nature? It doesn't ask why, it just asks what. It doesn't want to know why nature behaves in a certain way. It just asks what the behavior is. Okay? Now, science is possible because there are two consistencies in our experience. And I have called those two consistencies, I've given them names, regularity and objectivity. So I'm going to write those on the board, so we're going to come back to them later. Now, regularity means, as I define it, a persistence or a consistency in what we observe when we look at the world around us. We always see the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. That pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. And we begin to get suspicious that something, fairly repeatable is going on. And that's regularity. But there's something else, and that I call objectivity. And that is the fact that when we ask other people what they saw in the patterns of the sun, they agree with us. They also saw the sun rising in the east and setting in the west every day. So objectivity refers to the fact that other people's reports of their observations agree with our experiences, so that we have some confidence that we're not just hallucinating. All right? Now, the goal of science, once you got these two things, is to find a conceptual model which in some way mimics the behavior of the observed phenomena. Okay? And because of its ability to mimic the behavior of the observed phenomenon, if it's a really good model, it might predict behavior that you haven't seen yet. So it mimics what we've seen and hopefully predicts what we haven't seen yet. Now the process of coming up with a model and testing it is an interaction between subject and object. And I'm going to draw those two things on the board, and I'm going to make that distinction tonight for convenience. There's two boxes here, one that says me and one that says it, everything else. Now, when we look at it, we observe these regularities. We make observations. So there's an arrow going from the it to the me. That's sensory input, okay? In addition to that, though, we can do things to the it. We can perform experiments. And a scientific experiment is just that. It's an attempt on our part to poke Mother Nature in some way, to give it some kind of a stimulus, and then to observe the response. So science really is a set of planned stimulus-response experiments. And the purpose of that feedback process is to improve our model. So we observe regularities, okay? We come up with a model, conceptual model, and then we say, well, what if I looked over in the next cornfield where I haven't seen anything before, see if my model works over there as well. So you perform an experiment. You walk over to that next cornfield. You do something to stimulate the environment. You make an observation as to what the response is. So you've expanded your range of experience, and you've tested the predictive power of your model. If the model breaks down in this wider realm of observation, you have to refine it. You have to modify it. If not, okay, then repeat the process. Expand your experience even further by performing new stimulus-response experiments, testing a realm of observation that has not been tested yet. So science is not based on rigidly logical deduction. It's based on educated guessing. You intuit a guess about the way nature works from your experience. Then you poke nature to see a little bit more about how it works, to see how good your initial guess was. And that, in a sense, is a logical fallacy, because you're saying, well, since I've never seen a cat without a tail, I therefore intuit that there's a law of nature, so to speak, that says all cats have tails. In other words, I am generalizing from specific cases that I've experienced. And that's a logical fallacy. That's not logical deduction. So in that sense, science is based on a form of faith. It's a form of confidence in your model based upon an experience. So models are not true or false, but just better or worse, better tools of description or prediction over a wider or narrower range of experience or observation. And a second interesting thing we find is that science doesn't deal with essences. It doesn't deal with what atoms are. It deals with what atoms do to our senses when we poke them in certain ways. So science deals with attributes and not with essences. And then another interesting point that has to be made is the communal aspect of science. Because of the fact of this objectivity, this fact that others report the same observations as you experience, we can all agree upon what the observations are, what the patterns are, and therefore we can also agree upon whether this model is better than that one. That's why science can make historical progress, because each scientist can stand on the shoulders of the giants who preceded him. He can stand on a historical base of observations that other people have made and models, workable models that other people have come up with. So he's not starting from scratch. Now, on to religion. I've said that science describes the universe we live in. Religion tries to formulate an appropriate response strategy to it. Why is all this here? And what am I supposed to do about it? What's my response strategy to my own existence? So instead of coming up with a scientific or descriptive model, religion tries to come up with an ethical model. I'll call it an ethical model. And when we look into how ethical models are come up with and validated, we draw the same me-it diagram. Because we can do this because there are very many parallels between the methods of validation. In the religious method, in the method of validating an ethical model of some sort, there's me, and then there's it. Now, it, in this case, refers to all the people I have relationships with, the society, the physical environment, and it also includes a large body of historical observables that I can learn about. The first three are, of course, also can be stimulated in some sense. You act, you speak, and you see how others respond to you. There's an interaction going there. And because of this set of experiences, this set of stimulus-response experiments that we all do in our daily lives, we begin to come up with an ethical model that formulates a response strategy to all this. And that model has to, like in science, it has to be self-consistent, it has to fit somehow with our experience, not in a descriptive sense, but in a responsive sense. We have to have a successful response strategy. So there are some analogies here between religion and science. They both seek a cohesive conceptual framework for interpreting experience. They're both substantiated by confidence based on certain experiences that we've had, not on logical deduction or dry logical proof. Both religion and science deal with attributes and not essences. We can't get to essences in either realm. We can infer something about essences from the attributes. Well, this is where we run into some problems, where we get into trouble trying to push this analogy too far because there seem to be some differences between the two methods, the method of science and the method of religious search. And I refer to this as the subjectivity problem in religion, and you're all familiar with it. First of all, in the religious method, the method of religious search, The series of stimulus-response experiments is different for each and every different individual. We're not scientists gathering in a laboratory agreeing upon what experiments are going to be performed. The experiment is performed just by living. And it's not planned, it's not consciously undertaken to perform, well, I'm going to do these ethical experiments today. You just do them and observe the responses. It's not that systematic. And it's different for every different person, both in terms of what the stimuli are and what sectors of the environment are affected by those. Well, how does the Baha'i faith solve this? I mean, the Guardian says the Baha'i faith is scientific in its method, and that religion has objectively testable content. So how do we overcome the subjectivity problem? Better yet, how does Baha'u'llah overcome the subjectivity problem? Well, first of all, we must realize that the Baha'i faith is based upon a revelation. It's based upon a man, a manifestation of God, who actually lived in historical time and who wrote over 100 volumes of scripture. So we have a large body of historical and scriptural evidence about this man, about what he said, what he taught, what he did, what he suffered. So we have a large body of objective data that scholars can substantially agree. We also have a good sense of what Muhammad, Christ, Moses, and previous of these alleged manifestations taught, although the historical details are less clear. We have a good sense of what the spiritual tone of their teachings was, certainly. And we can correlate that with the teachings of Baha'u'llah. Okay, so you've got some objective evidence here. But we've still got a problem. Out of 10 seekers who look at this evidence, who examine this historical evidence, 1 accepts the Baha'i faith, say, and 9 reject it. So in what sense do we have any kind of objectivity here, or any kind of regularity? Certainly that 1 seeker saw some regular patterns in the evidence of history which rendered the Baha'i ethical model the best one. But the other 9 seekers perceived differently. Because different people, with ethical models, what makes sense to one person makes nonsense to another. Well, to lick this problem, this subjectivity problem, we have to return momentarily to science. In a recent Scientific American article, they did a survey on people's intuitive knowledge of physics, the paths taken by falling, sliding objects. And most people give the wrong answers. Most people have erroneous notions about the motions of everyday objects, falling bodies, sliding bodies, swinging bodies, things like that. They give the wrong answers. Even if they had a semester of physics, they still give the wrong answers. Now, especially sometimes if they've had a semester. What's wrong here? We know that everybody has ample sensory access to the evidence. We've all watched falling, sliding, and swinging objects all our life. Why can so few of us come up with the correct answers on a physics test? It's because that correct scientific modeling requires certain skills, certain intellectual skills, which enable us to pick out the correct or relevant things that lead to a good model for physical motion. Now, is there a similar set of skills in the religious realm? Well, that's where I also draw on the part of the Yagan, which is erroneously called the Tablet of the True Seeker. And in this, I believe, Baha'u'llah specifies an analogous set of spiritual skills and discipline which are needed to bring objectivity to the realm of religious search. Baha'u'llah admonishes the seeker to cleanse his heart from the obscuring dust of all acquired knowledge, to let go of all shadowy and ephemeral attachments, to cleanse his heart that no remnant of either love or hate may linger therein, lest that love blindly incline him to error, or that hate repel him away from the truth. And Baha'u'llah finally says, the true seeker must wash away from the tablet of his heart every trace of pride and vainglory. Okay? Now, I'm going to throw up what's the understanding that I came up with in this connection, and it's different from Jack's, but all the more interesting. That the Baha'i writings are so rich that an artist can come to it and see one thing, and a scientist can see something else, and both views are valid. It's all unity and diversity. Perhaps what Baha'u'llah is suggesting is that even among seekers, quote-unquote, very few possess the spiritual openness and humility to let go of the vested interests that they have in their current system of beliefs and explore new ethical models, even though those ethical models don't conform with what they might prefer to believe if it was just up to their taste or their ego or something like that. Now, how many people do you know who were unable to become Baha'is because they didn't want to give up drinking, or they didn't want to submit their egos to a higher power? In other words, how many, even among people who call themselves seekers, say reject or ignore the message of God for self-indulgent reasons? So, the Baha'i writings point to a simple conclusion, that if we adopt the methods that Baha'u'llah prescribes in this tablet of the true seeker, and we really let go of our vested interests and really approach this historical evidence with a true spiritual openness, that historical evidence, we know it's a revelation of God, we know it has objective existence, and therefore, if we exercise the spiritual skills of a true seeker, we must come to the right conclusion. It's just as in science. It's an objective. Religion is revelation, and revelation is an objective phenomenon. And those people who have access to the relevant observables and who have the right skills for evaluating those observables, they will reach the correct model. So the Baha'i faith is scientific in its method. Now, how am I doing on time? I have lots of time. Isn't that I think I'll take a nap. Now, an interesting outgrowth of this, and of course this me-it diagram, I don't mean at all to imply that this is just a reason-only process. The evaluation of this evidence, that this revelational evidence of the Baha'i faith, involves all our sensibilities and faculties, the rational ones as well as the intuitive ones, and even deeper ones that Jack in his talk touched upon. Now, an interesting outcome of this is that we're told to avoid the extremes of secularism and fundamentalism. In other words, secularism abandons revelation and clings purely to reason, whereas religious fundamentalism abandons reason and clings to revelation, which is the sad state of a lot of Christian churches today, that they have suffered that schism. And with the revelation of Baha'u'llah, we see that perhaps what we need to do is, instead of trying to choose between reason and revelation and divorce them, we should perhaps realize that man progresses by a robust interplay between the two. We receive a revelation, yes, and it's from God, yes, but it occurs within a historical context. It's communicated in using the tool of human language. It grows in the framework of historical events. And when we receive a revelation, we respond to it. We have to respond to it, or the revelation would be meaningless. Our response is as important as the revelation. And in responding to it, we grapple to achieve a clearer understanding of its wisdom in the light of new historical experiences that we have. And in this way, the divine guidance of one age becomes the obvious social contract principle of the next age. So man, in a sense, is performing a long-term historical experiment. He receives a revelation, and his subsequent historical activities, collectively speaking, test that revelation in the laboratory of history, or test departures from the revelation, as we have seen at other times. Now I'm going to go to the other side of the coin. Religion, not science, as a spiritual tool. In Gleanings, we're told about two purposes for which we were created. On the one hand, Baha'u'llah tells us to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. On the other hand, he says that our purpose, that man has been created to know his Creator and to attain his presence. Now, to know his Creator and attain his presence, that sounds like a very spiritual sort of purpose, whereas the ever-advancing civilization sounds more like a very earthly purpose. So how do we to understand the relationship between this? Because to understand the relationship between religion and science, we have to understand the relationship between earthly or physical and spiritual. And we see two purposes here, one spiritual and one seemingly more of an earthly sort of thing. Well, Abdu'l-Baha compares physical existence with a gestation period, a period in the womb. Just as a fetus in the womb is growing limbs and sensory organs which he will need to get around in the next world, we, as human beings in the physical plane, are developing spiritual attributes in this womb of ours, which we will need in the Abha kingdom. And therefore, one might suggest that by carrying forward an ever-advancing civilization, we attain spiritual skills, which enable us also to know God and to attain his presence. So there's a relationship here between physical things and spiritual things. Now, in connection with this, Baha'u'llah has told us to avoid two other extremes. On the one hand, he says avoid hedonism. Because hedonism or materialism is living material existence for the sake of material existence and ignoring the spiritual side of life, ignoring the only thing that's truly permanent about us. On the other hand, Baha'u'llah says to avoid monasticism and asceticism, which is sort of the other extreme. You try to get rid of the material world and just be purely spiritual. If there are any monks in the audience, I better duck for a moment while the brick flies. No, I don't mean to put anybody down by that. So this happy medium between monasticism and hedonism is what Baha'u'llah refers to as detachment. And detachment shouldn't be confused with deprivation. It often is. Detachment is living in the physical world and engaging in practical living, but you're doing it for a spiritual purpose. The detachment is a sense of priorities in why these physical things. And, for instance, money. In the hidden words, he says that wealth is a mighty barrier between the lover and his beloved. But on the other hand, in the same hidden words, he says that the best of men are they that earn a livelihood by their calling and spend upon themselves and their loved ones for the love of God. That's the qualification. Now, what does this have to do with religion and science? Science is a collective activity, partly individual, partly collective, which is concerned most directly with material things, technology, understanding of nature. Whereas religion is perhaps more primarily concerned with our relationship with something which is transcendent to the world of physical things. Now, in the Baha'i faith, we see that science has a uniquely high station. And I want to read you a couple of quotes. Abdu'l-Baha calls the perfection of arts and sciences the unshakable foundation. He says that the art and science are to be considered as acts of worship. And here's a very, very stirring quote. Abdu'l-Baha says, "The virtues of humanity are many, but science is the most noble of them all. The distinction which man enjoys above and beyond the station of the animal is due to this paramount virtue. It is a bestowal of God. It is not material, it is divine. Science is an effulgence of the sun of reality, the power of investigating and discovering the verities of the universe." And listen to this. "The means by which man finds a pathway to God. Science is the means by which man finds a pathway to God. Science is the first emanation from God towards man. Look at the high station of science. It's striking that a religion would say such things about science in view of the past adversarial relationship between the two things. But this high station of science is conditional. It's conditional upon science being useful and not being something that begins and ends in mere words. It is conditional on its use for the advancement of civilization, for the good of humanity, to increase love and concord and peace. And we know in the nuclear age, science isn't always used that way. It should be a tool in man's spiritual search to know and love God. Now, so the qualification for science to have this high station is that it be detached science. In other words, that we display collective detachment in our way of using science, in our reason for using science. Abdu'l-Baha says, "If then the pursuit of knowledge leads to the beauty of him who is the object of all knowledge, how excellent that goal! But if not, a mere drop will perhaps shut a man off from flooding grace. For with learning cometh arrogance and pride, and it bringeth on in error and indifference to God." Every kind of knowledge, every science is as a tree. If the fruit of it be the love of God, then it is a blessed tree. But if not, that tree is but dried up wood, and shall only feed the fire. So science can either be something which is the tool of our spiritual glorification, or it can be something that is the tool of our abasement, depending upon how and why we use it, just like money. So the term detachment, or collective detachment, is very applicable here to science. Now, one of the last things that I want to talk about is the fact that science as a spiritual tool is an aspect of science that's sort of hard to avoid for anybody with sensitivity, because you're looking at you're studying the work of God. You're studying the handiwork of the Creator. And many of the great scientists had a feeling of awe and reverence for God just because of the fact of their involvement with scientific discovery. I want to read you some quotes, and the following quotes are all from Gleanings. And they really exemplify how science is a tool of spiritual search because of the fact that nature reflects the attributes of God. Nature in its essence is the embodiment of my name, the Maker, the Creator. Its manifestations are diversified by varying causes, and in this diversity there are signs for men of discernment. Nature is God's will, and is its expression in and through the contingent world. It is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. Were anyone to affirm that it is the will of God as manifested in the world of being, no one should question this assertion. And he says, not an atom in the entire universe can be found which does not declare the evidences of his might, God's might, which does not glorify his holy name, or is not expressive of the effulgent light of his unity. I don't have time to read all the quotes here because they all go on in the same theme. Okay. You'll find one on Gleanings page 62, Gleanings page 65, Gleanings page 160, Gleanings page 177, and also from selections from the writings of Abdul Baha on page 41, there's a quote of a similar tone. And in Tablets of Baha'u'llah, the Tablet of Wisdom, page 142, there's also a quote of that kind. Now, I want to close with sort of an interesting example of this, which is covered in more detail in the manuscript of my talk, but I don't have time for the detail tonight because you'd be in a coma by the time I got through it. By avocation, I'm a physicist, even though I'm in the electrical engineering department because it looks more marketable on my resume. And no branch of science has made more stirring discoveries than physics in the last century. Some of our most sacrosanct notions of how things are have been completely and totally usurped by modern physics. There are many books out that do a very good job, I believe, of explaining modern physics to a person without the technical background. The Tao of Physics, the Dancing Wooly Masters, do a very good job of explaining the physics. So there are plenty of places you can go to get information on this for a non-technical person if you aren't, if you fall into that category. What I want to say is that the frontiers of modern physics today are searching for the most fundamental constituents of matter and the forces that are acting between those constituents. The tiny, the very, very small. And in this age, the very, very small has a profound impact on our understanding of the biggest. We don't understand the biggest, we don't understand cosmology until we understand subatomic particles. Why? The reason for this is that today we see a diversity of different kinds of particles and different kinds of forces. We see electricity, magnetism, the nuclear strong force, gravity, a whole zoo of different kinds of forces, and a whole zoo of different kinds of particles. Now, the speculation is that, in fact, there are not a whole zoo of these different kinds of constituents and forces, that they are, in fact, aggregates. The particles we see today are aggregates or configurations of a fundamental unified thing or stuff, okay? And that because of the way that these things clump together, they start displaying a diversity of different looking forces. But in reality, there's only one thing and one force. That's what some physicists believe anyway. Now, as you get back to the early universe, the whole universe gets very small and very hot. And the temperatures in the early universe, near what we call the Big Bang, are so hot that nothing can settle down sufficiently enough to clump together into these different arrangements of particles we see today. So whatever it was that was in the Big Bang, it was likely to have been the most fundamental building blocks of matter, or whatever it is, and the most fundamental force. Now, physicists had no idea, couldn't even speculate about this until at least the the 1930s. Baha'u'llah, in the Tablet of Wisdom, which was revealed in the perhaps 1870s, 1880s, when the old classical physics still held complete sway, and nobody had any notion about how matter at such a fundamental level behaved or how the universe came about. And we find in the Tablet of Wisdom this quote: "That which hath been in existence had existed before, but not in the form thou seest today. The world of existence came into being through the heat generated from the interaction between the active force and that which is its recipient. These two are the same, yet they are different. Thus doth the great announcement inform thee about this glorious structure." Now he is talking about, in a sense, the Big Bang, and the fundamental, perhaps, this is my speculation, it sounds like it anyway, because we know he's talking about something physical. He was not metaphorizing about something spiritual, because this was in response to a question from a seeker. And statements like this help to provide evidence for the alleged divine origin of the Baha'i revelation as soon as science is in a position to verify such a statement or discredit it, for that matter. And that's another way in which revelation provides objective evidence for its own divine origin. Thank you.
I'd like to really thank Brian a great deal. I don't know, I'm sure glad I don't have to choose between any of these speakers because they all seem very brilliant. Yes. I probably would embarrass Brian to tell you this, but I think it's very confirming. To me, it's very confirming that he's only been a Baha'i for a little over 2 years. He became Baha'i in 1981. So this confirmation of such wonderful spirit and depth of investigation of the writings should confirm us and get us busy teaching more people. Sorry, I just thought I should throw that in.